Hi, welcome aboard. We're very fortunate in Australia in being among the world's leading seafood producers. Now, not only do we produce a high volume of seafood, but also in certain cases, certain species of our seafood are unique to Australia and are truly delicious. And among the top of the list of those species are oysters. Now, opinion of oysters is purely a subjective thing. You either love them or you hate them. I number myself amongst the top 10 of the millions of people in Australia who truly love oysters. And we're very fortunate because we have species grown in Australia which are among the most delicious of oysters grown anywhere in the world. New Zealand grows beautiful oysters, as does the southern half of America, but the Sydney rock oyster is numbered among the best oysters in the world, and they're grown from way down on the Victorian coast all the way up to about halfway up the Queensland coast. They're grown in huge numbers, and they're supplemented by a new species which is called the Pacific oyster, which up until relatively recently has been regarded as a pest, but is also quite delicious to eat and has some other advantages. Now, one of our foremost oyster growers is Lloyd Moffat, who is based at Swan Bay on the western end of Port Stephens, and Lloyd and his wife Michelle run a tourist attraction there which is centred around oysters. Lloyd has a number of leases. Lloyd and his family have a number of leases around the Port Stephens area, and the oysters are brought in to Moffat's Oyster Barn, where they are either sent out around Australia and even exported overseas, or they're eaten with great delight by the thousands of people who visit Moffat's Oyster Barn each year at the tourist level. Now, there are a number of ways of reaching Moffat's Oyster Barn. You can drive there, and that entails a turn off from the highway just to the south of Karua, and about 12 kilometres off the highway into Swan Bay. You can go by coach, and a huge number of people each year from all over the world and all over Australia visit Moffat's Oyster Barn by coach, or you can go by water taxi, which leaves from either Nelson's Bay, the anchorage, or from Soldiers Point. Now, any of those ways are very pleasant. Probably the most pleasant is by water taxi, and if you really want to get there in a hurry and enjoy the trip, you can fly from Sydney or from Newcastle by float plane and land at Moffat's Oyster Barn. Now, Moffat's Oyster Barn offers a number of different attractions. Firstly, there is the restaurant. It's a huge restaurant in a great big tin shed, quite attractively decorated and with a large number of seats. And on a typical day, there'll be 3 sittings for lunch and there'll be 3 sittings for dinner. So as you can see, the food is superb and people truly appreciate them. One of the other attractions and one of the other ways of truly enjoying Moffat's Oyster Barn is to make it your destination for an extended weekend or even longer holiday, and you can stay in one of the cabins which are built around a lake just adjacent to the Oyster Barn there, beautifully set up, and offer truly comfortable accommodation whilst you're enjoying all of the delights of Moffat's Oyster Barn and, of course, of Port Stephens itself. And it's relatively easy, of course, to move around Port Stephens by water taxi or by other means, by driving, and use Moffat's Oyster Barn as a base to, as I said, sample the rest of the delights. You can also see oyster farming in action. Now, that not only happens ashore, where the oysters are sorted and packed, and some of them are opened and they're sent away, but also you can see the way in which the process is conducted on the water on the oyster leases. Now, Lloyd conducts a very interesting tour of the oyster leases. I'm going to hand over to him now for him to tell you a little about the growing of oysters.
Good afternoon, girls and boys. So we'll be just telling you a little bit about the oysters today. My grandfather started 100 years ago, picked up a few rocks, chipped off all the nice oysters, and they'd just keep growing. Now, we're just passing a rock lease going underwater over here that he used to chip them. So he'd have his little barge come across and he'd chip out the oysters. Now, as it was a hard work, and then he saw them growing around the trunks of the mangrove trees. So he chipped off the few of the oysters, and then he got the idea to cut the branch. So he cut the branches off the trees, trimmed them up, and as you see, and of course we wouldn't dare do it today with a mangrove tree being, lovely trees they are. But they just about cleaned out North Queensland years ago. They used to, all the oyster farmers went up and cut all the sticks, because these aren't very straight branches around here, so they used to have the taller ones. I haven't been there myself, but in the earlier days they'd cut all the branches. Now, then the oyster would swim through the water and catch onto the mangrove stick. Now, what has happened, the in the water there's all little predators, and so the mangrove stick is to wave in the air, not to put in the water. So all the borers and the cobra all love to eat the timber. So it took 4 years for the oyster to grow, but the timber wouldn't last. So he'd be losing all his timber because all the borers would eat the timber. After that, they found in the sawmills all the offcuts of timber, and they loved us many years ago when we said, hey, we can use the offcuts, why don't you cut them up into inch by inch slats for us? And which he did. They did. The timber yards cut them up, and we used to buy thousands of slats, as we call them. You prop your tomato stakes up, they're tomato stakes. Well, we nailed them up, tarred them with tar in the big tar pot. We'd let the tar dry on the timber, and the oyster would swim through and catch onto the... So when he does spawn, the oysters, they spit out the eggs, and it takes 3 weeks. They float around in the water, they form a little leg or tail, swim through the water, and fix onto anything solid. So hence the rocks, then the mangrove sticks, and then our sawn timber. So those were the slats. So you can see all the oysters swim through the water, and they all catch on singly. When they're tiny, you're just all these little specks. They're just little oysters. Now they all fight for this spot on the timber. There's millions and millions of them. So they all land singly. They give a little bit of a shove here and there and find their spot, not knowing that they're going to grow into be bigger and better, lovely oysters. So of course, on the stick was lovely. They all grew on happy, didn't fall in the bottom of when the timber rotted out, so it wouldn't rot out. So they happily grew on, and for 50 years we were happy to see them on the sticks, and they'd grow, and then we'd chip them off. We'd tap the stick, they'd all fall off, and then we'd just chip them apart and then open them. Again now, we still the same principle, but we make the crates up out of the vinyl slats. So if you've got any old Venetian blinds stuck under your house, we'll trade them in for you, give them 20 cents each. But no, on the vinyl slats, now the oyster identical, swims through the water and catches onto the vinyl slat. Now my brother was one of the creators of this, and they've got them to make the vinyl with the little timber grain in them, so when the oyster comes through he still thinks he's catching onto we didn't want to lose him, so he thinks it's catching onto the timber. So we twist them and bend them off, and then we put them from there into the cylinders. Now this cylinder opens at the end. I probably can't get it apart, but the end just comes out, and we put, say, maybe 2 kids' sand buckets full of oysters in there, maybe about 1,000 oysters. That's how small they are. So I put 1,000 oysters. This sits across the rack. We have a rack in the water, sits across the rack, and when the tide comes in and out, they come up when the tide comes in, and when the tide goes out, they drop again.
Thanks, Lloyd. Now, as you can see, they are a fascinating creature, and the way in which they're grown is fascinating. There's quite a lot of skill and experience, and with over 100 years of experience within the Moffat family at Moffat's Oyster Barn, we can see quite clearly why the oysters are so good and are so valued all over the world. Now, I mentioned a number of ways of reaching Moffat's Oyster Barn earlier. One of the things I didn't mention was the fact that you can get there by helicopter from Newcastle, and Steve Basic runs a helicopter service, and we actually used his helicopter to shoot some of the beautiful pictures you've just seen. Steve is often at Moffat's Oyster Barn and can actually be booked if you're having a large party excursion to Moffat's Oyster Barn to fly joy flights all over Port Stephens during your stay. And I promise you that really is an experience, because Port Stephens is beautiful at any time, but the day we were there, the sun was shining, there was no wind, and it really was a magnificent experience to fly over the port and see how beautiful it was, backed up by the fact that we had the delight of having lunch at Moffat's Oyster Barn and also flying around the area. Now, if you are in the Newcastle, Port Stephens area, if you're travelling south and you can time your arrival in the Port Stephens area, particularly the Karura area, for lunch or for dinner, whatever you do, make the short 12-kilometre excursion off the highway into Moffat's Oyster Barn. I promise you, if you like oysters or any kind of seafood, you will never regret it, and you'll go back time after time. We'll be back right after this break.